On the 7th of September 1945, the victorious Allied nations paraded down the Charlottenburger Chaussee in Berlin. The Americans showed off their M24s, M20s and M8s, the British their new Comets and Sextons, but the Soviets would use this opportunity to reveal a completely new vehicle, the IS-3. The distinctive pike nose and low hemispherical turret shocked the West. So much so that American, French and British designers were immediately instructed to rapidly develop vehicles that could rival the Soviet behemoth. But now, with many decades of research and hindsight on our side, we can see if that was a smart decision or just wasted effort, because we can finally answer the question, was the IS-3 actually any good? Before we can begin to answer this question, we need to determine what we're measuring it against. So we need to first take a look at their existing design, the IS-2. The IS-2 was, at its core, a development of the KV-1 that the Soviets had developed in 1939. I have videos on both the KV and IS program, definitely check these out first. First in combat in February 1944, the IS-2 was a great vehicle. The Soviets managed to create a heavy tank with the weight and dimensions of a contemporary medium tank. It had a bigger gun and thicker armour than Germany's Tiger, despite weighing about 10 tons less. But studies at the front were also highlighting issues, mainly the thickness and quality of the armour, as well as the low rate of fire of the massive 122mm gun, cramped crew conditions, and generally poor component quality. Obviously, this is the USSR, so we don't care about nonsense like crew conditions or component quality, but the armour was a big concern. Tests showed that a 76mm IS-3 field gun, shooting from about 500 meters away, could penetrate the IS-2 from any direction. And if the IS-3 could penetrate, then the German 75 and 88mm guns would have no problem whatsoever. So, on the 8th of April 1944, the State Defense Committee published Decree No. 5583, titled, "On the Production of an Experimental Prototype of a New Heavy Tank at the Kirov Plant." The main point of this decree was to develop a new vehicle, or a modernised IS-2, which would be able to withstand hits from the Panther and Tiger, both to the hull and the turret, at any distance. There were also 6 other minor points, like installing a large MG on the roof, no more fuel tanks in the driver's compartment, better clutch, etc. Plan number 100 had completed their hull design by the middle of June, while the men at Chelyabinsk, already distracted by their own heavy tank design, worked very slowly on the new turret. The hull arrived for final assembly on the 2nd of September. The frontal armour was massively improved, with a single 100mm plate angled back at 60 degrees. This protected it from the Panther, Tiger and even the King Tiger at reasonable ranges. The turret was 130mm, offering it roughly equivalent protection. And I can only apologise here for the lack of images or drawings, but we just don't know what this vehicle looked like. It ended up being scrapped and no photos survive. But some testing reports did, and we could determine a few things from those. Compared to the IS-2, this new tank had 13 significant changes, including the new frontal armour and a new V11 engine putting out about 600 horsepower, with a cooling system sort of similar to that used on the Panther. But unfortunately, it wasn't very good. The primary fan casing kept being destroyed, the engine was unreliable, the transmission was overloaded, the cross-country performance was even worse than the IS-2, and the ventilation barely worked. So importantly, the decision was made in late 1944 that the new tank would use the same engine, transmission and suspension from the IS-2, but only the armour and layout would be improved. This allowed production lines to keep going, gave the new vehicle a reliable, or at least familiar backbone, and meant less development work overall. And fortunately, we do have photos of this second version, the Kirovets 1, sometimes referred to as Sample A. So this was essentially the new armour scheme plastered onto the skeleton of an IS-2, with, as you may have noticed, a new turret. This turret was a revelation. In many ways, the IS-2's turret had been somewhat taller than necessary. It had been originally designed for the KV-85 and IS-1, which used one-piece ammunition for their 85mm guns. And while the 122mm rounds were larger overall, they were stored in 2 pieces, which meant that they could be stored more efficiently, and those big flat turret sides were no longer necessary. The Kirovets 1 turret took advantage of this, squashing down into a hemisphere and arranging the front piece of the ammunition around the turret walls with the charges stored in the floor. The front of the turret was made of a narrow 250mm thick casting, with the cheeks ranging from around 220mm to 70mm. The steeply angled sides and cheeks meant that 250mm was probably the weakest point on this turret, at least frontally, making it essentially immune to even the newest German anti-tank gun, the 8.8cm KWK-43. This was a massive improvement to the 100mm armour, flat sides and tall silhouette of the IS-2. The hull armour was also a large improvement. The single upper plate was 120mm thick and the lower plate was 90mm thick, with both being angled at 60 degrees from the vertical, giving 240 and 180mm effective thickness respectively. Tiger-proof. On the 24th of November 1944, the Kirovets 1 completed a 30km factory run, and the day after completed the slightly more rigorous 50km military acceptance run without comments. And this is hardly surprising, as the IS-2 powertrain underneath was relatively reliable and the extra armour had only added about 1.5 tons to the vehicle, a 3% weight increase. On the 16th of December, Kirovets 1 was transferred into state testing, including intensive automotive trials, as well as being fired at by a captured Nashorn and an ISU-122. These test reports showed that the frontal armour of the Kirovets 1 could stand up to the Nashorn from 350 metres, and the ISU-122 from 690 metres. It even measured the depth of the dent created by both projectiles. It passed the 500km test but didn't quite reach the gold standard of 1000km, with a ventilator fan failing at 810km in. But the examiners did note that this was as reliable as, if not more reliable than, a typical IS-2. Following these trials, the Kirovets 1 was recommended to be adopted into service as the IS-3. But you know as well as I do that this is not the IS-3. No. See, around November 1944, they were still coming up with ways to improve the IS-2. One of these ideas would become the IS-2U. This was the vehicle, or at least concept of a vehicle, that would first use that distinctive pike nose. Instead of making the front hull armour out of simple slopes like the Kirovets 1, the nose of the IS-2U was constructed of 3 plates, with the upper plate consisting of 2 plates angled not only on the vertical plane, but on the horizontal, meeting in the middle along a central seam line and leaving a little triangle atop. This was advantageous in a couple of ways when applied to the IS-3. Firstly, the extra slope in the other plane meant that to achieve the same effective thickness, each plate could be 10mm thinner and a good bit lighter. It also meant that the little triangle at the top could be used for an actual driver's hatch, providing a boost to visibility and giving him a quick way to escape the vehicle rather than clambering backwards and out of the turret like on the IS-2. Thinner and lighter armour was critical for the IS-3's design. Remember, this vehicle is ostensibly a modernisation of the IS-2 and uses the same engine, so keeping additional weight to an absolute minimum was a critical concern. The turret and pike nose are great, but there was actually another, perhaps even more significant weight saving that is just more difficult to spot. The IS-2 side armour was shaped like this, with about 100mm at this top section and 90mm down here. But the IS-3 used this shape, 90mm thick the whole way. This 60-degree inwards angle meant that even the side armour was crazy thick, 180mm effective protection the entire length of the tank, saving weight, adding protection, and adding interior volume. But it's sort of hidden behind a lot of stowage bins, so it's sometimes difficult to tell what's going on. The IS-3, with its new fancy armour, passed tests with flying colours in April 1945, as we can see in the official report. The IS-3 tank, presented by the Kirov plant for range tests in terms of operational indicators and reliability of mechanisms and assemblies, is equal to the series IS-2 tank. The hull firing conducted showed clear advantages in armour resistance compared to the IS-2 tank hull. The IS-3 tank is recommended for series production with the elimination of shortcomings noted in the present report. So, to answer our initial question, was the IS-3 any good? It is a resounding yes. The Soviets successfully modernised the IS-2, massively increasing its armour protection while maintaining the IS-2's mobility and reliability, as well as some extra bonuses like a driver's hatch. And it was only 500 kilograms heavier. It was an engineering masterpiece, the best tank in the world. It was... What is it, comrade? Oh, Germany surrendered. The war's over. Well, this changes things. Suddenly, the IS-3 found itself in a very different situation, with far higher standards. This whole video I've been discussing the IS-3 in comparison to the IS-2, but I've never asked the question, was the IS-2 reliable? Was the IS-2 well designed? And did you notice this sentence at the end of that report? Before we get into this next section, a very quick word from one human being to another. Being a military history YouTuber is quite tough at the moment. Generative AI is getting harder to spot, and human creators are being drowned out by a sea of military history slop content that YouTube doesn't seem all that interested in getting rid of. All I'm asking is for you to scroll down a bit and subscribe to my channel if you've been enjoying the video so far. It helps my videos and videos from other similar human creators get recommended to you instead of AI, which helps us both out and allows me to keep making this sort of content. Anyway, as soon as the war ended, the priority that had been given to heavy tanks' raw combat performance disappeared. In post-war Europe, operational readiness and reliability took center stage. In peacetime, a single tank is expected to provide years, if not decades of service before being retired, something that the IS-2's powertrain simply could not do. But the IS-3 had other issues too. The crew had to remove the commander's and loader's seats to get in and out of the turret, and this removal took too long. The gunner's seat was too high, the commander's sight couldn't see farther than 1,000 meters, and the gunner's sight couldn't traverse. The crew compartment filled with toxic propellant gas when firing, even with a ventilator, and this ventilator was often destroyed by cartridge cases as they flew out the back of the breech. So we can see that even if you're going to forgive the IS-3 for the sins of the IS-2, it still had a whole host of unforgivable design defects. These weren't done to save time or resources, they were just poor decisions. A nation that had been using armoured vehicles in frontline combat for 4 years should have known better. But anyway, the Soviets now found themselves with a vehicle that was unreliable, uncomfortable, and filled with design defects that should have been ironed out well before it had been rushed into production in May 1945. These defects and issues were so severe that production was halted just over a year later in July 1946, and work began on modernising the over 2,000 brand new IS-3s. This took a long time. The IS-3 was never designed for long-term service, and neither was the IS-2 powertrain at the heart of the vehicle. Refitting the entire tank for this post-war world was extremely challenging and labour-intensive. By the end of 1951, more than 5 years after the IS-3 production run ended, there was finally a modernisation procedure in place. It consisted of more than 120 multi-page instruction booklets for restoring, repairing and modernising almost every component in the vehicle. The work was completed at the Kirov plant between 1952 and 1953, and these works were extensive. The entire hull was made more rigid, the engine mountings were reinforced, the gearbox mounting was redesigned, the clutch was improved, the sealing was overhauled across the board, a lot of manual components were replaced with electric ones, the radio was improved, the sights were replaced. It was a lot of work, and it was expensive. For each of the 2,305 IS-3s, this surgery cost about 260,000 rubles, and for context, a brand new T-54 cost 325,000 rubles. And to the Soviets, this wasn't even a proper modernisation. The actual IS-3M modernisation would happen just a few years later, meaning each vehicle had to go under the knife again. In this second procedure, the engine was replaced with a derivative of the V-54, the same engine used on the T-54. This made the vehicle a lot more reliable, as well as reducing maintenance and spare parts costs. However, after this modernisation, most of the IS-3Ms were sent to long-term storage, rather than back to frontline units. But there were exceptions. Up to 200 of the now obsolete tanks were sent to the so-called fortified areas along the Chinese border in the 1960s, being used as pillboxes. In fact, the only time the Soviet Union ever used the vehicle in anger was an embarrassment, with IS-3s being sent in to brutally squash the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and being pounced upon by insurgents, destroying a number of vehicles with Molotov cocktails and other improvised anti-tank weapons. Egypt, however, received about 100 IS-3s and 60 IS-3Ms, and did take them into actual combat, going head-to-head against Israeli Pattons, Centurions and Shermans in the Six-Day War of 1967. The then 22-year-old IS-3s did not perform all that well, a slow vehicle with slow rate of fire and bad optics placed into a dynamic, maneuver-based combat environment. The gun was still potent, and Egyptian crews managed to knock out a few M48 Pattons, but it was a very one-sided affair. Training among the Egyptian troops was also very poor, and many vehicles were abandoned before even entering combat with the enemy. All in all, they lost 73 of their IS-3s during the war, and 40 of these were captured intact by the Israelis. So let's return again to the question, was the IS-3 actually any good? I believe you could argue both sides to some extent. If the war had lasted another year or even another 6 months, the IS-3's combat performance, shrugging off 88mm rounds as it blasted through Eastern Europe towards Berlin, would have allowed it to enjoy the same reputation as the IS-2. And this is what it was designed for, to immediately roll out of factories and into combat against the Germans. The armour scheme was revolutionary, and managing to increase the armour of the IS-2 to that extent without a significant increase in weight was an incredible achievement. But then the war ended, and the goalpost shifted. The role the IS-3 was expected to play dramatically changed overnight, and it was not a role that the IS-3, riddled with design defects and chronically unreliable, could actually fill. So I'll leave it up to you. Was it a brilliant World War II redesign, or a rushed Cold War propaganda piece? I think it's also interesting to note that the IS-3, while it may not have actually been a great vehicle in itself, it caused so much panic in the West. The M103, Conqueror and AMX-50 heavy tank projects were all designed specifically to take on the IS-3, as well as even more ridiculous vehicles like the FV 4004 and 4005. In hindsight, this was probably mostly wasted effort, as main battle tanks were soon to banish all of these designs into obsolescence. So there's that. I've always been fascinated by the IS-3 and the Western counters to it. Massive guns versus seemingly impervious pike armour. So in one of my latest videos, I take a deep dive into what actually happens after a tank gets hit, and attempt to show you what chain of events need to occur before the tank crew is in any trouble. How angling or armour composition affects penetration, and how an APS or ERA can save your life. This video, as well as this one and this one, are available exclusively on my Patreon for as little as $5 a month, which also gets you early ad-free access to all my videos and access to the luxurious Red Wrench Lounge Discord server. Being a human being on a very AI-focused YouTube is getting more difficult by the day, so I really do appreciate any support you can give. And thank you so much to all those who already support me on there. I genuinely could not do it without you, and it means a lot. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out my other Soviet tank videos if you enjoyed this one. I'll see you next time.